Good evening and welcome to the wrap-up of round 6 in Tata Steel. We're about half the way through the tournament and we can notice that Kovalyev, he is struggling, he's having a bad week, got another loss today against Giri, and in the top we have the young Ferrugia and Wesley So. Two guys that I predicted will be dangerous this year, and so far they're having a good week. We can see that there's been some movement in challengers, and we're happy that Grandelius got his second win in a row, so he's getting back into the tournament and getting closer to the top. Hopefully he can keep up and get a few more wins and really fight for the first place in this tournament. Today we're gonna focus on the game between Yu Yi and Ferrugia. Then we will follow up with Dubov against Artemiev and, like usual, finish with the Grandelius game. So let's start with the first game, and we can see that it was a Sicilian, the Najdorf variation, and here Yu Yi played bishop e3, which is the most usual move, I would say. But there's a lot of options in this position. We will see in the Grandelius game the new bishop d2, a slower move, but at the same time a developing move, maybe creating some opportunities with bishop a5 sometimes, stopping the queenside pawns, and there's a lot of other moves like h3 with idea g4 just to start attacking on the king side. But Yu Yi chose bishop e3 and e5. That's one way to play, but there's a lot of other options. With knight to c6, for example, you can play g6 and try to turn it over to a dragon variation. But Ferrugia went for e5, very normal so far. The idea is just to close off some squares and also make it harder for white to play f4. So it's more of an active move, but at the same time he is leaving some squares. The light squares on d5 and f5 are weak, and the whole game will be a fight about d5. White will jump in, and if black managed to play d5, break loose and exchange some pawns, then he will be happy. Queen c7, a4, preventing b5 with the idea bishop to b7, putting some pressure on the diagonal, and e4. Developing moves, bishop e7 and bishop e2, and Ferrugia castled, and so did Yu. Bishop e6 and a5. So we can see here that it's not only d5 that is a weakness, now you can play against b6 also. At the same time, black will get the c5 square for a knight. Place h6 to prevent knight to g5 and try to chase this bishop away. Because the bishop on e6 is a key piece for black, while the bishop on e2 is not that good for white. So if black would play something like bishop c4, let's say something like this, then it would be nice for white, because then this bishop on e7 is weak, the squares on d5 and f5 are even weaker when the bishop on e6 is gone. So then the knight can jump in, or the other knight might reroute to f5. So h6, a normal move. We have knight to d5, and this is more or less forcing to exchange the knight. He got the opportunity to move the queen also, but d5 is the only square to avoid a fork. And then the bishop is coming and the knight is jumping in, so it's simply winning for white. And Ferrugia took. And we have a different kind of structure among the pawns. So white is having majority on the queen side and black is having the majority on the king side. At the same time, it white is a few tempo ahead and is able to maybe quickly play c4, c5 and even b4 to help the pawn reach c5. Black will fight to stop the pawn from reaching c5. And bishop f5, c4 and knight to d7 to cover the key square. We have a rook to c8. So there's actually 5 pieces covering c5. We have d6, we have the bishop on e7, the rook and queen, and the knight. So after playing the rook to c8, he got some possibilities to move the queen in the future also, and still have a really good cover on c5. Rook to c1, moving the queen, and Yu is rerouting his knight. And the move knight to f6 is a move I don't like for black, because now he is leaving the c5 square, and he should maybe just start playing on the king side, moving the bishop somewhere, maybe even to h7 to be able to play f5, f4, maybe g5, and start attacking while he still got cover of c5. But after moving the knight, white is having easier opportunities to push for c5. And queen to d7 is also maybe not. I'm not really sure about the idea of Ferrugia here. Sure, he maybe want to bring another rook to d8 and try to put some pressure on d5 when c5 is coming. But d5 is pretty easy to cover. So we have rook to d1 covering d5, and after knight to g4 threatening the bishop, but at the same time the light square bishop of white is not a key piece in the game. It's not doing that much. c4 is closing the diagonal. It will never be a magical bishop having an open diagonal between a8 and h1. So he simply exchanged it with the knight, keeping the dark square bishop, trying to put up some control on the e4 square, and at the same time creating the opportunity to push c5. So white's more or less accomplished what he was desiring or hoping for. Wanted to push c5, opening up a square on c4 for the knight, and simply using his majority on the queen side to create something. We have queen to b5, and you want to exchange queens. I'm not sure if he could. That's a good idea. He could maybe just play the knight. If, for example, he takes, you got the. You can play d6 maybe, or even just jump in with the knight and then take back. But yeah, it's not wrong, because it's always tricky here. He wants to take back with the pawn. Jumping in with the knight immediately would maybe make him have to take with the bishop. And this pawn structure is not the one he was hoping for. Maybe even jumping into e2 is better for black. So now this pawn on d5 is alone. It's still a nice position for white. White got some advantage, but he wanted to keep the pawns together. And if he managed to exchange the queens, there's not that much danger. So we have bishop to d3, and Ferrugia, he want to reroute his bishop to b5 instead of having it on f5. Feeling that this diagonal from a4 to e8 is more important for the bishop to try to cover the pawns marching instead of having a bishop on this diagonal. And you exchange and place the knight on e4, putting pressure on d6, exchanging the pawn, and at the same time Ferrugia had to exchange a rook. So white's accomplished everything he wanted, and black is having problems here. So it feels like the whole idea with knight to f6, queen to d7, and yeah, it was not the best way forward to let white advance with the pawn from c4 to c5. He exchanged and bishop to b6. So now white is entering with the pieces and having a really nice advantage here. And bishop to c5. So Ferrugia got to go back. If he exchange here, you will not take with the pawn. He will cover his pawn first, and then start pushing d6, rook to c7, and the king is far off. He got at least 3 moves to come back into the game. And there is no proper way entering for the king, because if he wants to go down, it's always a check. You got to go back up, and then d6, for example. Sure, in this case maybe f5 is a move. That's what white got to watch out for. So yeah, maybe even starting with something like knight to c3, just covering everything, bringing the king up to cover the pawn before he starts attacking. So Ferrugia kept the bishop, and you brought his king, and f5. This is maybe not good to allow, because f5 is making the knight go back to c3, and then he don't have the opportunity to bring the knight to c5, which should be his goal. So here seems to be a little bit tricky move. He wants to move this bishop somewhere. So maybe something like bring the bishop back, but then he's closing off the opportunity for the king to enter. Maybe a move like bishop a7, but the bishop is not doing so much over here. And at the same time he wants to push d6 and allow a square on c5 for the knight. So the best move seems to be bishop f8, because here we have d6 like a threat. Black can't take the pawn because the bishop is hanging, and at the same time another threat is knight to c5. So I'm not really sure what black should do here and how to protect all these threats. For example, going back with the rook, this bishop is hanging, and then either advancing with the pawn or picking up this one. And playing the bishop down, then at least he threats the pawn. So d6, and we have another threat, knight to c5, so he got to somehow prevent it. And if he takes on b6, bishop takes, he got to move the king or block with the knight. Still a very dangerous pawn here, and I'm not really sure how black will get out of this trouble. Of course, another option is, instead of, for example, after bishop d8, d6, b6, there's maybe a possibility to play bishop e7, making black exchange. He got to take this pawn, but then something like this, and you will lose b6, but at the same time you might get f7. But this is not a proper advantage for white anymore, because the bishop is good when you play on two sides of the board. So this was one opportunity where Yu missed his chances. He's not really been having his best tournament so far this week, Yu. He's missing his opportunities. So d6, got to go back, because if black would take, this bishop is hanging on c4 in the end. So bishop d8. Yeah, he plays knight to a4. Also another move that I don't really understand, but sure. And he jumps in, allowing Ferrugia to take the knight, and there is a block on d7. So they agreed on a draw here. Black will simply not move either the bishop or the rook, just bringing the king over, and it's not possible for white to advance. So a game that yeah, was drawn, but it felt like Ferrugia had a wrong idea in the beginning of the game, allowing c5, playing the knight to f6 and queen to d7, and Yu Yangyi not really taking the opportunity in the end of the game to take it home. So we have a draw. Let's move on to the next game. We have Dubov against Artemiev. So let's see what happened between the young Russians. We have Dubov playing e4 and Artemiev answering with the Caro-Kann. This is the same type of opening with h4, h5 and c4, which Ferrugia played against Artemiev and won in round 3. And Dubov chose to not really play the same way, not completely. Taking on h6, because the knight on g8 needs some squares. Bishop is in the way on e7, he wants to jump up to f5, and f6 is covered by the pawn, so the only square he got is h6. Bring the knight over to f5 and put some pressure on d4. So Dubov took it because the dark square bishop is a little bit stuck behind his pawns, so at the same time as he's exchanging probably the worst of his pieces, he's making Artemiev having to take with the rook and not being able to castle in the future. so it will take some time to bring the king over and bring the rook back into the game. At the same time, he will have to maybe play g6, which will weaken some dark squares around the king. The rook to c1, and the king starts moving. g3 to cover h4 to be able to castle himself. And we have g6, creating some weaknesses. And castle and king to g7. So white is ahead with about 2 tempos, because black would, for example, like to have the rook on c8 instead of h6, and these 2 tempos he will try to use best possible way to just break through on the queen side and double up and get the initiative, hopefully bringing a rook down to the 7th rank. So let's see if he managed to create something. But Artemiev is making a great mistake here, taking the knight on c5. Feels like this is strategically not the best move, because the bishop on e7 is covering f6 and g5. So when exchanging the bishop, he is helping white to double up on the c file. At the same time, he is losing control of the dark squares around the king, which can be devastating. And then it will be easier for white to create some attack. For example, knight to g5, queen to f3, and maybe pushing g4 in the right moment. And just putting pressure on f7, bringing maybe the queen to f6 sometimes. And let's see how Artemiev tried to protect here with queen d7. Dubov is tripling on the c file. And a5. But for example, if he would keep the bishop, he could maybe have brought the queen up, play a6 himself, bring the queen back, play the rook to either c8 or d8, and just centralize his pieces, maybe even double up on the c file. And at the same time, he will not allow any attack on the king side, because the bishop will be covering. So it would be hard for white to break through. But okay, let's see what happened. Tripling on the c file and a5. And we have a3 to prevent knight coming to b4. a4 and knight to e1. This move is a little bit slow. He should probably play knight to g5, bring the queen over, maybe play king g2 and prepare an attack with g4. But when playing the knight to e1, he is allowing black to do something. Try exchange pieces. For example, knight to e7, and you don't want to exchange everything here. This is just equalized, and maybe even black is having an edge because it's easier to attack d4 than f7, and the white pieces are far off from attacking. At the same time, planting the knight on f5, and black is completely fine. But he maybe don't have to take everything. He would probably play something like moving the queen, just to put some pressure, but then maybe just going back. Or simply, after a move like queen b4, just taking on c5. Because white don't want to take with the pawn. Then this pawn will be weak, and this pawn also. At the same time, black got the covered passed pawn that can start running. and taking with the rook, then he can try to exchange another rook. If he moves to chase a pawn, then black is accessing c1. And after an exchange, it's very hard for white to create something. So I think Artemiev missed an opportunity to just exchange some pieces after knight to e1. But he didn't take the opportunity. He played queen to e7 to try to cover the dark squares around the king. The knight went back, queen went back, and king to g2. So now Dubov started to prepare his attack. But still, it's maybe the best option to just play something like knight to e7 and try to remove some pieces from the board. Artemiev played rook to c7, queen to c2. Maybe the right way forward is again knight to g5, putting some pressure, bringing the queen over. Because black can never take here, the rook is hanging on c7. Okay, queen to c2, queen back, and he is rerouting his pieces and slowly building up the attack, Dubov. Rook to a6. Not really sure what the aim of Artemiev's last three moves been here, but he's maybe aiming for some extra protection on the 6th rank. If white would in some positions be able to, for example, sacrifice a knight on e6 or on f7, but yeah. g4, and Dubov is trying to break through. Artemiev is bringing the rook over into the game. So his idea was to play rook to b6, put pressure on b2, maybe planting the rook on b3, just to create some activity. Queen takes, queen f6 check. And now he is allowing white to grab the a file, threatening the pawn and threatening a checkmate on a8. One check and Dubov moved the king. Knight to d8, trying to cover the last rank, but after rook to a8, there's no proper way to protect. So, solid game by Dubov. He took his chance, pushed with g4 and created an attack on the king side. Artemiev had maybe an opportunity to play knight to e7, just to try to exchange at least one rook, maybe even both. But from the beginning it felt like the main strategical mistake of this game was when Artemiev took the knight on c5 with his bishop from e7. The bishop was covering the dark squares, and when he gave it away, then strategically it was an easier game for Dubov to play. So those two games were what we wanted to focus on in the Masters, and let's move on with the Challengers, where our own Grandelius got his second victory in a row and is climbing back to the top. So let's see what happened. Another Sicilian, and Grandelius like tactical play with the Najdorf variations, so he played it again here, and Van Forest tried bishop d2, a very unusual move. Um, it's very. I'm not really sure what the plan is, but it's maybe allowing a quick castle. It is a developing move. Maybe trying to cover the attack from black when playing b5, b4, using a weakness on a5, somehow trying to plant the bishop on a5, and yeah, or even just develop normally with bishop d3, castle short, and just put the queen on e2 and play f4. So Nils answered with knight to c6, which was maybe not the best way forward. I'm not sure. Maybe e5 was an alternative here. And then try to push d5 as soon as possible, because when the bishop is on d2, d5 is easier for black to play. So for example, moving the knight, bishop to e6, and then bishop d2 is more of like a tempo loss. For example, bishop g5 and knight to d7. e5 might have been a way forward, but also after e5 it's possible to play something like knight to f5, but either taking it or just playing g6 should be fine. Also, of course, the regular knight to f3. But yeah, still it's the same plan for black, trying to push d5 as soon as possible. Knight c6, probably not a mistake, but yeah, he should try to punish bishop d2 as soon as possible. We have bishop d3 and g6. g6 is also a move where he's going back to a type of position which he is familiar with bishop on g7, playing c5 and the regular Sicilian setup. But instead of g6, there's also an opportunity to play a move like e5 now, putting the bishop on e6. The knight that might go to g5 is gone. Then after a move like bishop e6, for example castle, bishop e6, it's possible to push d5 early and punish bishop d2. Because in the end he might play bishop g5 anyway. And then bishop d2 was just a tempo loss. But we have g6, and now we can see that after a regular setup for black with g6, bishop g7, white is aiming for f4, e5, and also having opportunities with bishop a5 in some positions. Rook to d1 and e5. So usually when you play g6 and bishop g7, you don't want to put the pawn on e5, just to block this bishop. So if he wants to play e5, then he should kept the bishop on e7 instead. And instead of losing the tempo with g6, trying to push d5. We have knight a4, and Van Forest is having a pleasant position. He will put the bishop either on b4 or a5, maybe playing knight to b6, c4, and after e5 the pawn on d6 is very weak. So this is what he's gonna target. Nils is jumping around to f4 with his knight. and knight to f4, which Van Forest took. A little bit surprising because he don't want to give away the dark square bishop for the knight. This dark square bishop is probably his best piece when the pawns are on the white squares. And the bishop on e2, that's the one he wants to exchange. So a move like, say, bishop e3, targeting d6, and for example exchanging the white square bishop would be a pleasant position for white. Targeting d6, he got a strong bishop, can play b3, for example f5, f3, just covering. Or maybe even in this kind of position, not even bothering, just going to pick up d6. While the bishop here on g7 is a little bit stuck behind the pawn on e5. So maybe the wrong way forward for Van Forest. We should be happy for Sweden. He aimed to grab the pawn on d6. Still a good idea. Another move that is giving white a tempo. After bishop e5, white is able to play knight to b6, knight to c4 maybe. But he started with bishop f3, also okay. And sacrificing an exchange to have a very active knight and a very dangerous pawn. There should be a slight edge for white because black can't really advance somehow. For example, after b3 and knight to c4, white is completely fine. See here, queen to a5, pinning the queen. Creating some threats. We have rook to e6 to target the pawn on d6. Bishop g4, a very good move. Attacking the rook, so the rook got to move. If he moves to f6, the bishop will be hanging. And if he goes back, it will be possible to push d7, for example. And then it's impossible to cover both the bishop and the rook with this rook. Then this rook will be hanging on d8, and if he plays a move like rook to f8, then the bishop will be hanging. So a move where Van Forest will get the exchange back. Probably the best move for Nils might have been something like sacrificing back. Taking. And in the end it will be something like 2 pieces against the rook. Sure, active rook, but it shouldn't be enough. You can just go back, cover everything, protect the knight, and slowly build up the game with 2 pieces. But Nils tried f3, and Van Forest made a huge blunder here. He took on e6 and allowed the queen to take on g2. But after f3, he can simply just take the pawn. And Nils is in the same kind of trouble like before. He probably got to give away the exchange somehow. Got to find the best possible way to give it. But yeah, white is having a really nice advantage and should be winning this game. But after bishop takes e6, a huge blunder, Nils could simply pick up some pawns, even grabbing d6, because We have, for example, if the knight takes, this one is hanging. If he goes back, it's a checkmate. And if the king goes up, we have another check here. Grabbing this one. Or even just simply checkmating here. So this might have been what Van Forest overlooked. The rook takes d6. He probably thought he was winning anyway. And after rook takes d6, this is completely winning for black instead. We have bishop d5, and Niels is simply picking up the piece because the rook is pinned. And now it's Niels that is pawn up, a very dangerous pawn on f3 that instead of the dangerous pawn on d6. Van Forest tried to push, and yeah, Niels is also pushing. Exchanging the pieces and simply winning this game. For example, after d7, he would just take on d7 because the rook was hanging. Trying to bring the king over, Niels exchanged the queens and is two passed pawns up, these two, and yeah, he can just push them. And this is where Van Forest gave up. Really nice game where Nils took his shot, but Van Forest was better and could have used it much better than he did. A huge blunder when he took on e6 and allowed queen takes g2. He could simply just have taken with the g-pawn on f3 and yeah, continued having his advantage, getting at least the exchange back, having a dangerous pawn on d6. A completely winning position, I believe. But he made a mistake and Nils took the opportunity. Now, after two wins in a row, he is climbing and hopefully he can grab another third win in a row tomorrow. And tomorrow we're gonna have another secret guest. So don't miss that, and good night.